Not every king dies beautifully. Sometimes he rots in front of everyone. On a hot August day in 1598, in the silence of El Escorial, a nightmare unfolded that was unlike any palace intrigue or spy novel. The windows of the monastery palace complex were deliberately locked, not to keep out the heat, but to hide the stench coming from inside. Philip II, ruler of an empire on which the sun never set, did not fall by the hand of an enemy or a poisoned sword, but died from his own body, from festering flesh, crawling lice, and swarms of blood-sucking flies. The son of Isabella and Ferdinand, the man who stood at the origins of the Counter-Reformation, the organizer of the Council of Trent, the victor at sea from Lepanto to the Strait of Gibraltar, had already gained fame for his harshness and foresight several decades earlier. Under his leadership, powerful armadas were built, the freedom of the Netherlands collapsed, and the English Invincible Armada was wrecked on the stormy ocean in 1588. His personal holiness was expressed in the composure of the throne and the monastic asceticism of the Escorial, built between 1516 and 1584. But now this colossus was cracking from within. At the age of 72, Philip had been suffering from gout for decades. The joints of his fingers and toes burned unbearably, and the skin on them blackened and cracked. Until the very end, he signed decrees, decided the fate of nations with a single yes or no. And decrees and papal bulls flowed from the pen of the great monarch. And then, in June of that year, the temperature soared within the walls of El Escorial, and feverish delirium set in. First his knee swelled up, then his hand. The wounds would not heal, and pus dripped onto the sheets. Doctors resorted to bloodletting, applied leeches, made poultices from medicinal herbs and prayer spells, but the king's body slowly decayed. Spanish etiquette had no pity for the infirm. Instead of ceremonial bows and noble curtsies, servants rushed into the chamber, choking on the stench. The damp heat of the chambers mixed with the smell of incense, but nothing could drown out the smell of decay. Tons of aromatic handkerchiefs soaked in perfume only slightly softened the suffocating stench. Soon clouds of lice joined the sores, hidden in the deep folds of his thighs and back. The warm, damp flesh was the perfect environment for them. Witnesses recorded how servants pulled insects by the handful from the monarch's wounded body, but at the same moment, a new swarm descended on the old wounds. And then the carrion flies appeared. Attracted by the putrid smell, they laid their eggs directly into the decaying tissue. Every morning, lush, white, dead larvae twitched in the wounds like living creatures from a nightmare. During the day, they were cleaned out with silver trays, but when evening came, they returned. The king, who remained lucid until the last minute, heard the rustling of these creatures, felt them gnawing at his flesh, and prayed, "Lord, forgive me and accept my suffering." But the sky remained silent. Along with the abscesses, bed sores began to form on his thighs, back, and shoulders. The skin swelled with watery heaviness, burst, and became new sources of infection down to the bone. Servants frantically scooped out the pus and cut away the dead flesh, but the dirty sheets were repeatedly transformed into a barren landscape of death. The role of king gave way to that of a carrier, weakened, decayed, and helpless. His cloak and crown lay aside, and he lay in his own excrement and bloody juice, confined to the quadrangle of his bed, which had become a battlefield between life and decay. It would seem that the fate of a man who had fought holy battles and inspired Spanish galleons had ended in a literal battle for every scrap of skin. In September, visceral diarrhea was added to his torments. Feces flowed in an endless stream, turning his bed into a miserable swamp. Doctors unsuccessfully applied dried herbal ointments, rubbed sulfur into his wounds, treated them with arsenic solutions, and even took blood samples for analysis, but only made his condition worse. Instead of relief, he experienced new spasms of excruciating pain, and yet Philip's spirit remained unbroken. Every day the gospel was brought to his bedside, and psalms were read to him. The man whose name made the Catholic world tremble clung to divine consolation more than to life itself. Thus ended the epic. On the 15th day of September of that year, the king's breath ceased, but the memory of that slow and terrible death remained forever. The Escorial, into which he had poured his soul for power and piety, became the tomb for his living, decaying body, a grim reminder that might is powerless before the inexorable laws of nature. What horror! The great king, over whom the sun never set, died among his own ashes and rotting flesh. Philip II's cries echoed through the cold stone corridors of El Escorial, shaking even the massive walls. His heart raced, his breath came in short gasps, and he suffered from severe shortness of breath and a painful dryness in his mouth. But even in the midst of the most violent attacks, the mighty monarch did not abandon his duty. Between convulsive gasps, he studied documents, listened to reports from his advisors, and gave orders to his ministers. His will remained steadfast, while his body increasingly resembled a dilapidated fortress. The heat of central Spain that summer spared no one. Inside the monastery pantheon of El Escorial, the stone walls accumulated heat day and night, turning the king's bedroom into a hellish furnace without a single draft. The windows were kept tightly closed by royal decree, not out of pride, but so that the smell of the ruler's decomposing body would not defile the country. Even the servants could barely endure the stench. In early September 1598, it became clear that the end was near. Philip summoned his son, Prince Don Felipe, heir to the Spanish throne. The young man could barely stand when he saw his father in funeral clothes, literally decayed and emaciated to the point that the king was unrecognizable. The prince left the room to get rid of his nausea, but returned. His heart demanded to see how power and greatness had collapsed in the face of imminent death. "They now consider me an old dog," Philip whispered with difficulty, his voice trembling between lamentation and a final command. He tried to convey the truth to his son. Neither crown nor dignity can save you from the decay of the flesh, and pride is nothing without life. On the morning of September 13, 1598, the king received his last rites, confession and communion. His confessor washed his body with holy oil, but even the sacred oil could not drown out the foul smell. Flies circled over his crowned head as if celebrating their victory over such a powerful ruler. The liturgy ended in meaningless thoughts. Death was already dancing on his face. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Philip II breathed his last breath. The king, who once ruled colonies in America, the Netherlands, and Italy, and whose name was borne by the Philippines, fell victim to his own ailments. Chronic gouty arthritis, diabetes, and festering ulcers had reduced his body to ruins. At the slightest touch, the tissue tore, and a foul-smelling liquid oozed from the wounds. Servants hurriedly sprinkled the corpse with perfumes, incense, and frankincense in a futile attempt to hide the decomposition. Sark was sealed in a tomb, and the funeral rites were reduced to a minimum. There was no open coronation, and it was impossible to take a last look at the king. Philip II now rests in the dark dungeons of El Escorial, among the remains of his father and several wives. Europe reacted in different ways. In Protestant England, some published mocking articles, punishment for the fires of the Inquisition and the blood of the Dutch. But Queen Elizabeth I, according to legend, remarked, "Do not mock the misfortunes of princes, they remind us of our mortality. These words sound deeper than any laughter. In Spain, however, mournful silence reigned. Official chronicles praised the king for his faith and fearlessness, remaining silent about worms and decomposition. The myth of the infallible monarch was to live on for centuries. In reality, however, the causes of his death were a combination of gout, diabetes, infections, and bed sores. The doctors did everything they knew: bloodletting, poultices, laxatives, but 16th century knowledge was no match for time. This is what makes Philip II's death truly tragic. A man who had crowns born and die under his rule was unable to ward off his smallest enemies: microbes and insects. Historian William H. Prescott later wrote that neither power nor wealth can save a person from the laws of mortality. This is the true power of this story. Not in its horror, but in its unvarnished truth. No one leaves this world undefeated, neither the great nor the rich, nor those chosen by God's grace. The death of Philip II is not just an episode, but a monument to Memento Mori, which has outlived every decree he ever issued. Today, El Escorial reminds us that life is always at stake, and there are no exceptions. The black corridors of El Escorial whisper the truth. Even the greatest king is powerless against his own decay. Those who saw the end of Philip II are truly frightened by the beginning of any story about power. When, in the 1560s, construction of a monastery palace began in the vicinity of Madrid by order of the king, no one could have imagined that decades later, the majestic Escorial would be transformed from a symbol of power into a cold Gothic mausoleum. Architects Juan de Batista de Toledo and Juan de Herrera put thousands of volumes from the monastery library, golden altars, and austere audience halls into the walls. As if the walls themselves were unable to deceive, they are frozen in stone and occasionally remind us of the transience of the world. Today, tourists crowd into halls with gilded reliquaries, listening to stories about the unyielding faith of the King Emperor, but they feel no hint of decay beneath their feet. The dusty emptiness seems to have erased everything: the persistent smell of rotting flesh and the disturbing moans in the darkest corners of the palace. However, sometimes, through the thin film of light in the cracks of the windows and ventilation hatches, the question returns: what remains of a man who has been eaten by grave worms? In 1598, Philip II entered his final agony. Gout, paralysis of the limbs, and high fever robbed him of his last strength. According to contemporaries, the most terrible thing was not death itself, but the endless pain that preceded it. When the king's eyes could still see, but his soul was already leaving his body, when his even commanding voice could still be heard, but it was impossible to move or think. After his death, a mysterious note was found among the monarch's personal papers: to be or not to be, it is the same as never to have been. There was no decree, no will, only a bitter glance at the meaninglessness of his own end. The court chroniclers in their subsequent volumes only mentioned Philip in passing. Some described him solemnly, others reduced him to diplomatic successes and religious strictness without venturing into details. But in the cracks between the official lines, decay still seeps through, the smell of decay and a bitter reminder that pride rots and crowns rust. Neither cardinals nor court physicians nor royal ministers could save the king from our most evil fate, from his own body betraying us at the most inopportune moment. Only flies and worms treated him honestly. For them, he was not a monarch, but merely a piece of living matter, warmth and food. And therein lies the bitter irony. The majestic ruler whose fame spread across half the world in his final moments became equal to each of us, mere flesh, doomed to decay. Faith was Philip's last refuge. He did not seek solace in hope. but in an attempt to find meaning in suffering and order in decay. And perhaps it was in this state, not divine ascension, but complete physical vulnerability, that he found what he was looking for: integrity in the face of death, albeit a grim one. Philip II's legacy is not luxurious palaces and victorious battles, but a warning engraved in the walls of El Escorial. It lives not in triumphant monuments, but in that cold feeling that clings to your throat when you remember. All glory is but a fleeting reflection, and true power lies in the ability to accept your own end. When the sun rises again over Spain, the country does not yet know that it has already fallen. Philip's power slowly crumbled not in battles, but in fatigue, in the weight of brocades and ceremonies, in the bitterness of loss, and in the invisible weight of the royal coffin. His son, Philip III, ruled silently without his father's iron fist, perhaps because he saw where excessive knowledge of pain leads. At court, people continued to smile and bow, but behind closed doors they whispered strange stories of masses interrupted by the mournful buzzing of flies, of trays of meat devoured not by humans but by decay. Artists tried to erase the traces of weakness by painting ideal portraits in a glowing light, but no brushstroke could convey the main thing: the feeling of impending decay. Today, Philip II is remembered primarily as the king who defeated the Armada and the unyielding defender of Catholicism. But people try not to talk about how he died, as if the very fact of his decay says too much about us. Meanwhile, acknowledging this end means acknowledging our own vulnerability. After all, the tighter we hold onto our crowns, the louder the whisper of stone. Everything ends in decay and dust. Have you ever wanted to peek behind the scenes of great power? In the cold corridors of El Escorial, there are no royal entrances or pompous speeches, only the disturbing buzzing of flies. Philip II, King of Spain and nicknamed the Quiet One, called himself an instrument of God, but instruments rust and gods remain silent. He ruled a vast monarchy from 1556 to 1598, when the inevitable moment arrived at the vast Renaissance complex of El Escorial, a palace, monastery, and burial place all in one. Completed in 1584 on Philip's orders after the victory at Saint-Quentin, it was supposed to be an eternal temple of greatness. But beneath the luxurious vaults, a very different truth was hidden. When Philip lay dying, his bodyguards and courtiers whispered discreetly, "The disease, typhoid fever, feverish delirium, was rapidly wasting away the king's body." Travelers wrote in their diaries about his unquenchable cold and how he refused incense and lavish ballads, preferring silent contemplation. Philip spent his last days in one of the palace chambers, where the wind blew through the tall windows and the heavy stone walls. They say that it was then that creatures invisible to the naked eye began to enter his chamber: flies and carrion beetles, worms crawling over the king's body. They came not for the crown or the scepter, but for something more ancient, for the flesh exposed beneath the royal splendor. The royal physicians wrote in their notebooks, "The king is fading like a candle, and with him the idea of infallibility is dying. All that remains is the memory of his last breath, echoing in the silence of the huge building." But El Escorial does not forget. Its walls are imbued with the cold and shadows of events that cannot be spoken of in prayer or by royal decree. Tourists wander through the palace, admiring the library with manuscripts collected in 1540 by order of Philip, admiring the luxury of the Hall of Kings, but completely unaware that beneath their feet lies a silent witness to the death of a great ruler. Historians argue, was the king's death a harbinger of the collapse of the old systems? Some see him as a symbolic victim of a time when empires devour their own foundations and sooner or later collapse from within. Others consider him a prophet without promises, whose fall opened people's eyes to the true price of power. The crown becomes a heavy burden when there is no strength left to pray or command. With his final breath, Philip II departed not as a victor, not as an instrument of the Almighty, but merely as a body, as vulnerable as any of us. All that remains is history, carved in stone, in the echo of footsteps in cold corridors, in the buzzing of flies that can drown out any human word. And perhaps this is the true curse of power. It does not die with the body, but lives on in the memory of the places where its grand collapse took place. Did you know that the mighty Philip II, ruler of Spain, did not die a hero, but revealed his weaknesses to everyone? His death was remembered not in triumphant songs or jubilant cries, but in simple and terrible honesty. Philip II, whose prestige seemed unshakable, said exactly what was expected of a monarch, about duty, honor, and power. But he did not shine in the glare of glory. He shone with his cruel sincerity. Perhaps this is where the true scale of his reign lies, not in victories over enemies, but in defeats before his own self. During his 45 years in power, from 1556 to 1598, he experienced ups and downs. He suppressed the rebellion in the Netherlands, suffered a fiasco with the Invincible Armada in 1588, and yet insisted on the construction of the grandiose Escorial. This monastery palace complex, built in honor of St. Lawrence, was intended as an eternal testimony to the power of the Spanish crown and faith. Now its corridors are silent, but if you listen closely, you can hear a faint sound. It is memory scratching at the walls like an old louse on yellowed skin. We live in an age that fears its own end. It hides its wrinkles, ignores the approach of death, fills the void with anything it can find. Noise, news, endless conversations. But perhaps this is more dangerous than any disease. After all, what is hidden from the light only takes root more deeply. What we don't say out loud grows in the shadows. The story of Philip II did not remain behind the scenes of the past. It is close to each of us, in every hospital ward, in every hierarchy of power, at the very moment when we think, this doesn't concern me, but it does. Always. After all, we are not golden thrones, but fragile cells doomed to time. What will we do with this knowledge? Will we suppress it within ourselves or talk about it? Will we pass it on not for the sake of sensation, but out of responsibility, for memory and truth, for those who believe that there is no end to them? If this story has touched you, tell it. Not as an old retelling, but as a monument to what power cannot do, what history silences, and what remains when empires crumble. Take a look behind the scenes, breathe in the smell of old velvet, see the person behind the mask. After all, we are all equal. Not in birth or glory, but in decay. Some leave quietly, others with a bang. Philip II became a warning, and although his body has long since turned to dust, somewhere the illusion still lingers that some of us are immortal.